Racist police officer humiliates and wrongfully arrests a black military leader. But when he discovered his true rank, he began to sweat cold. Louis Thompson was adjusting his black leather gloves as he walked down a quiet street in the neighborhood where he had grown up. The crunch of dry leaves under his boots echoed in the calm night. His dark eyes scanned every corner of the place with nostalgia, but also with a faint trace of unease. It was strange how, after so many years in the military, a simple walk through his childhood neighborhood could make him feel so vulnerable. He wondered if the weight of years and experiences had made him more aware of how fragile civilian life could be. In his world, danger was tangible, visible, and faced with force and strategy. But here, on the streets he once roamed as a child, danger seemed subtler, hidden behind glances, unspoken words, and prejudices. The night wind blew softly, caressing his face. He had gone out that night to clear his mind, to leave behind the echoes of violence and the difficult decisions that came with his rank. The title of general wasn't just a responsibility, it was a burden, a weight he carried with him in every step he took. And though the war was behind him, the internal battles persisted. Just as he crossed the main street, he heard the unmistakable sound of a patrol car approaching. At first, he didn't pay much attention. It was a common occurrence in that neighborhood. However, the sound of the engine slowing down made him stop. He turned slightly, just enough to see a police car pulling up right next to him. Officer William Davis, sitting at the wheel, watched with a mixture of distrust and frustration. He had had a long day, full of tensions at home and at work. His thoughts were in chaos, but what tormented him the most was the feeling that he was losing control of his life. The job he once loved was now a constant source of stress, and his marriage to Margaret was falling apart before his eyes. That night, the accumulated resentment and rage accompanied him on his patrol. So, when he saw Louis walking alone through the neighborhood, something in his mind, burdened with prejudice and grudges, urged him to act. Davis abruptly got out of the car, the sound of the door closing echoed in the empty street. He shone his flashlight on Louis, momentarily blinding him. "Stop right there," he shouted authoritatively, quickly approaching. Louis, surprised by the tone, raised one hand to shield himself from the flashlight's glare while raising the other in a gesture of calm. He had no idea what was happening, but he wasn't a man who sought unnecessary conflict, especially with the police. "Is there a problem, officer?" Louis asked with a neutral but firm tone, not losing control of the situation. Davis looked at him with disdain, not bothering to lower the flashlight. His eyes scanned Louis from head to toe, looking for something, anything, to justify his growing frustration. "What are you doing around here at this hour?" Davis asked with a challenging tone. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Louis took a breath, maintaining his calm. It wasn't the first time he had faced this type of situation, but it always hurt. It was always unfair. "I'm walking, officer." "Getting some fresh air? Is that a crime?" Louis responded, trying not to show he was affected, though he felt the tension building in his chest. Davis stepped closer, invading his personal space, challenging him without any apparent reason. "Give me your documents, now," Davis demanded, completely ignoring Louis's response. Louis, keeping his composure, slowly took out his wallet and handed over his military ID. Davis grabbed it brusquely, not even looking at it before shoving it into his pocket with no intention of checking it. "That's not necessary, officer. If there's a misunderstanding, I'm sure we can resolve it by talking," Louis said, trying to keep the situation from escalating. But Davis wasn't interested in resolving anything. His own insecurities, prejudices, and the emotional chaos in his personal life blinded him. He couldn't see Louis for what he really was, just another citizen, quietly walking. He saw him as a symbol of something he hated, of something that overwhelmed him. "You're under arrest," Davis suddenly said, without explanation as he took out the handcuffs. Louis felt the injustice of the situation hitting him hard, but he didn't resist. He knew that any wrong move could make things worse. However, he couldn't believe what was happening. He was a man of honor, a respected general, and now he was being humiliated in his own country, in his own neighborhood, for no apparent reason. Davis cuffed him too tightly, squeezing the cuffs as if he were dealing with a dangerous criminal. The pain in Lewis's wrists intensified, but what hurt the most was the treatment. The abuse of power. The lack of respect. It was a deep wound that went beyond the present moment. "I'm taking you to the station, and we'll see how brave you are when we investigate you," Davis spat with disdain as he pushed Lewis toward the patrol car. Lewis, swallowing his anger, got into the car without saying anything more. It wasn't the time to fight, not like this. He knew there were other ways to fight, more effective ways, but the humiliation burned inside. As the patrol car drove off, Lewis looked out the window, the streetlights flickering in the distance, and wondered how he had reached this point. Meanwhile, in Davis's mind, a storm of emotions raged. Part of him knew he was acting wrongly, that he was letting his own personal issues and prejudices guide him. But another part, a darker one, enjoyed the feeling of control, of power over someone he perceived as different, as inferior. "Are you proud of this, officer?" Lewis asked from the back seat, with a calmness that seemed sharp. He knew his question didn't need an answer. Davis said nothing. The silence in the car was deafening, only interrupted by the sound of the engine and the tense breathing of both men. He didn't know it yet, but that arrest would change their lives forever. Both were about to unearth secrets that connected them in ways neither of them could foresee. The patrol car drove into the night, taking them toward a destiny filled with mystery, intrigue, and revelations that would transform their worlds forever. In the cold and sterile interrogation room at the station, Lewis Thompson sat handcuffed in front of a metal table. The pale glow of the fluorescent lights fell on his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. He had spent hours in that small makeshift cell, listening to the noises of the station, the footsteps coming and going, and the murmurs of the officers. No one had given him an explanation. No one had allowed him to make a call. The treatment he was receiving wasn't just unfair, it was a direct affront to his dignity. As Lewis tried to stay calm, on the other side of the building, William Davis was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. He stood in front of his desk, holding Lewis's identification. For the first time since the arrest, his eyes stopped on the words that froze him: General Lewis Thompson, United States Army. A cold sweat began to form on his forehead. What had he done? He hadn't just arrested an innocent man, he had arrested him without cause, and now he was faced with a reality he never imagined. He had humiliated a man who not only outranked him in the military hierarchy, but was also a hero to many. "Are you all right?" one of his colleagues asked as he passed by the desk, noticing the paleness in Davis's face. William barely managed to respond. "Yes, everything's fine." But it wasn't. He knew what he had done wasn't just a mistake, it was a monumental error. Yet there was something else that bothered him, something that kept him awake and anxious. The name Thompson echoed in his mind, as if he was trying to remember something important. He had heard it before, in another context, in another time, and it stirred a restlessness in him that he couldn't fully identify. Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, Lewis was beginning to lose patience. His thoughts grew darker, and with each passing minute, he felt the weight of a system he had once sworn to protect but was now turning against him. Finally, the door to the room swung open and William entered, accompanied by another officer. Their eyes met immediately, but what Lewis saw in Davis's expression wasn't the cold indifference he had felt during the arrest. Now he saw confusion, perhaps even remorse, though it wasn't clear if that feeling would be enough to right the wrong. William approached slowly, unsure of how to start the conversation. The man he had arrested wasn't just a general, but he had a commanding presence, even while sitting under those circumstances. William felt small in front of him. "I'm sorry," William began, his words awkward, stumbling in the air. Lewis looked at him coldly. "What are you sorry for, officer? My baseless arrest or your own shame?" Lewis replied, his voice firm but controlled. William opened his mouth to respond, but no words seemed enough. The room filled with an uncomfortable silence. The other officer present cleared his throat and spoke instead. "Mr. Thompson, we've reviewed your identification. It's clear there was a mistake in your arrest," he said, trying to inject some calm into the situation. "Mistake," Lewis repeated bitterly. "Arresting a man because of the color of his skin is not a mistake, it's a choice." William felt the ground collapse beneath him. Lewis's words were sharp, but he couldn't help feeling that he deserved them. What he had done wasn't just illegal, it was immoral. And the guilt was beginning to eat away at him from the inside. "I'm going to release you right now," William said as he pulled out the key to the handcuffs. As he did, his hands trembled slightly. The metallic click of the cuffs unlocking echoed in the room. Lewis rubbed his wrists, feeling the dull pain from the pressure of the restraints. Despite the humiliation he had endured, his face remained unchanged. He was a man accustomed to facing adversity, but this, in his own country, at the hands of those who were supposed to protect, hurt in a different way. "Is that all, officer?" Lewis asked as he stood up, his tall, sturdy figure dominating this small room. William swallowed hard, unsure of what else to say. He felt overwhelmed by shame and confusion. He knew he would have to face the consequences of his error, but there was something more at stake. Lewis's voice cut through him, but there was also something in his own past, something connected to that name. He wanted to speak, to explain, but couldn't find the right words. "I shouldn't have arrested you," William finally said, his voice cracking slightly. "Not like this. I made a terrible mistake." Lewis looked at him, evaluating his words, his tone. What he found in Davis was genuine, but also a deep uncertainty. Something in this man wasn't right, something beyond the obvious racism he had displayed. "This isn't just a mistake, Davis. It's part of something bigger. Part of a wound that's still open in this country," Lewis replied, his tone more reflective now. "But you're not the only one to blame. It's not just about what you did tonight. It's about what you're not facing within yourself." William felt those words cut through him like a sword. For years, he had tried to hide his resentment, his hatred, but Lewis was looking at him as if he could see straight into his soul, as if he understood something that William himself hadn't been able to articulate. "How did you become this way?" Lewis asked, in a tone that wasn't accusatory, but more inquisitive, as if he genuinely wanted to understand what had brought William to this point. William couldn't answer immediately. His thoughts traveled back to his childhood, to the endless fights between his father and mother, to the shouting and threats that filled their home. He thought of his father, a violent man, an ex-military who had raised him with an iron fist and words full of hate. But it wasn't something he could easily put into words. He was trapped between his past and the present. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice heavy with pain. It wasn't an excuse, it was a confession. Lewis studied him for another moment before nodding slowly. There was nothing more to say. Both men carried invisible scars, but Lewis knew that William's were deeper than anyone could imagine. Though that night, William's hate had targeted him, Lewis also recognized the internal battle the officer was fighting. "The only thing I know," Lewis finally said, as he headed towards the door, "is that we all have a choice to make, Davis. We can live carrying hate, or we can choose to be better. But that's a decision only you can make." With those words, Lewis left the room, leaving William behind, lost in his thoughts. He knew that Lewis's words would stay with him much longer than he had expected. As he left the station, the night remained as dark as before, but for Lewis, something had changed. He didn't know what consequences this encounter would have in the future, but he knew the story wouldn't end there. Something deeper was yet to be revealed, something that connected his life to William's in ways he didn't yet fully understand. The sound of the front door softly echoed through Lewis's house, a subtle signal of his arrival after a night full of tension. Olivia, his wife, was in the kitchen, finishing preparing the tea they usually shared before bed. She hadn't expected him to arrive so late, but when she heard the unmistakable sound of keys, something in her heart tightened. She knew something had happened. She could feel it in the air. She had always had a sharp intuition, especially when it came to Lewis. Their life together, marked by long absences and hurried goodbyes, had taught her to read more into silences than words. Louis entered the kitchen, his face marked by a mix of exhaustion and something else, something Olivia couldn't immediately identify. He placed his coat on a chair and sighed, as if the weight of the night had worn him down more than he had expected. "Is everything all right?" Olivia asked softly, approaching him with a steaming cup in her hand. Louis looked at her, feeling how her warmth brought him a momentary peace. However, the emotions he had held back during the arrest and the subsequent encounter with William began swirling inside him, struggling to surface. He took the cup but didn't drink, merely holding it in his hands, searching for the right words. "I was arrested tonight," he finally said, without preamble. Olivia remained silent for a moment, trying to process what she had just heard. Her mind filled with questions, but before she could formulate any, Louis continued. "A police officer, William Davis. He stopped me for no reason, cuffed me, and took me to the station. Just for walking in the neighborhood." Louis's voice was deep, but controlled, as if he were trying not to let anger take over. However, Olivia could see the emotional scars behind his calm demeanor. She knew what this kind of injustice meant to her husband. It wasn't just about being arrested. It was the invisible violence of being judged and humiliated for something as simple as the color of his skin. A reminder that, despite his achievements and his rank, the world wouldn't always see him for who he really was. "Louis," Olivia whispered, reaching out to take his hand. "I'm so sorry." Louis squeezed her hand lightly, grateful for her support. But there was something else that troubled him, something he didn't quite understand. "This man, Davis," he began, his gaze lost in the memory of the interrogation room. "It wasn't just racism. There was something in him, something broken. And I don't know why, but I feel like I know him. Or maybe I know someone like him. There's something about his name that feels familiar." Olivia looked at him with concern. It wasn't the first time Louis had mentioned this kind of intuition, this feeling that something from the past was resurfacing. But this time, his tone was different. It was darker, as if the arrest had opened a door that had been closed for years. "Do you think he could be connected to you in some way?" Olivia asked, trying to better understand her husband's feeling. "I don't know," Louis replied, finally taking a sip of tea. "But I can't shake this feeling. When I looked into his eyes, I saw something more than hate. I saw pain, resentment, as if he were trapped in something much deeper than just his own prejudices." Olivia frowned. She knew her husband well, and she knew that when Louis had a hunch, he was rarely wrong. She decided that investigating on her own might not be a bad idea. "I'm going to see if I can find anything about him," she said, her tone determined. "Maybe we can understand better who this man is and why he acts the way he does." "I don't think this ends here." Louis looked at her gratefully. He knew Olivia was determined, that she wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth. And while part of him wanted to leave the incident behind, another part, deeper, knew he had to keep going. Not just for him, but for all those who had been victims of that kind of injustice. As Olivia began her investigation, William Davis sat in his car, parked in front of his house. He couldn't go inside. He knew Margaret, his wife, would be waiting, but after what had happened, he felt he couldn't face her. His mind spun around what he had done, how he had arrested an innocent man, a general. But what disturbed him the most wasn't the mistake, it was the name Louis Thompson. That name sounded familiar, not from the news, but from something more personal, something buried in his childhood. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, memories of his childhood began to flood back. The shouts of his father, a brutal ex-soldier who had raised him under a regime of fear, returned to his mind. His father had always talked about a traitor, someone who had left him behind during a mission. A man he had sworn to get revenge on, a man whose name echoed like a distant sound. Thompson. William opened his eyes suddenly, breathing heavily. It couldn't be a coincidence. Not after everything that had happened that night. But if it were true, if the man he had arrested was connected to his family's dark past, then everything he believed about his father could be at stake. He finally entered the house, trying to calm his nerves. Margaret looked at him from the couch, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration. She knew their marriage was in trouble and that William had been distant for weeks. But this time, his expression was different. "What happened tonight, William?" Margaret asked, her voice softer than usual. William looked at her, hesitating for a moment about whether to tell her the truth. But he couldn't keep holding so many secrets, not when he felt his entire life was falling apart. "I arrested someone, Margaret. But I made a mistake." "A big mistake," he said, sitting beside her, feeling the weight of his confession. "Who?" she asked, trying to grasp the magnitude of what he was saying. "A man named Lewis Thompson. He's a general, and I had no reason to arrest him. It was unjust, it was." William paused, his eyes filled with guilt. "But it's not just that. I think my father was connected to him somehow." Margaret looked at him in disbelief. "How could your father be connected to a general in the army?" she asked, surprised. "I don't know, but my father used to talk about a man named Thompson. I think he betrayed him on a mission. And now I feel like everything is coming back, as if it's part of something I don't understand." William rubbed his temples, his mind in chaos. Margaret remained silent, trying to process what William was telling her. But deep down, she too felt that something more was about to be revealed, something that connected them all in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Olivia's investigation progressed, and soon, the secrets of the past would begin to emerge, connecting Lewis and William in ways that would transform their lives forever. Olivia Thompson was sitting at her desk, the dim light from her lamp illuminating the keyboard of her computer. She had spent hours searching for information, connecting pieces of a puzzle that seemed more complex than she had imagined. Each search led to more questions than answers, but she wasn't giving up. She knew that somewhere in that vast network of information lay the truth about William Davis and the connection Lewis felt with him. Something deeper and darker was hiding in this story, something beyond the unjust arrest. The sound of the keys stopped when she found an article that caught her attention. It was an old report, a war story from many years ago, during a military mission in which Lewis's platoon had been involved. William Davis's name didn't appear directly, but that of a man did, Raymond Davis, his father. Olivia felt a pang in her chest. William's father had served on the same mission as Lewis, but what she read next left her stunned. Raymond Davis had been accused of treason. The report described an incident where, during a critical moment, the team had been ambushed and some soldiers had lost their lives. The subsequent investigation suggested that someone from the platoon had leaked sensitive information to the enemy. The evidence pointed to Raymond, but due to a lack of concrete proof, the case remained unresolved. However, his reputation was tarnished, and he was forced to retire under the shadow of that suspicion. Olivia leaned back in her chair, taking in what she had just read. This was bigger than she had thought. The relationship between Lewis and William wasn't just a coincidence, but a direct consequence of an open wound from the past. She decided she couldn't keep this information to herself. She had to talk to Lewis as soon as possible. When Lewis returned home that night, exhausted from a long meeting at the base, Olivia was waiting for him in the living room, sitting with the serious expression she always adopted when something important needed to be discussed. "I found something about Davis," Olivia said bluntly. Lewis stopped halfway through taking off his coat. Something in his wife's tone alerted him immediately. He sat down in front of her, the tension palpable in the air. "What is it?" he asked, his voice grave, aware that what he was about to hear would change everything. "His father, Raymond Davis. He was on the same mission as you, and he was accused of treason," Olivia said slowly, measuring her words. "It's all in the military reports, though the case was never officially closed. It seems information was leaked to the enemy, and some men died because of it." Lewis felt the air in the room grow heavier, suffocating. He remembered that mission, the chaos, the pain of losing comrades, and the suspicion that had corroded their team from within. Those were dark times, and although he had moved on from the incident, a part of him had always felt that the betrayal had never been fully resolved. "Raymond Davis," Lewis murmured, as if the name was taking on new meaning in his mind. He looked at Olivia, memories flooding his mind. We always suspected there was a traitor, but there wasn't enough evidence to accuse anyone directly. Some believed it was him, but in the end, the high command let him go. That explains why William was so out of control when he arrested you, Olivia continued. He must be carrying the resentment of what happened to his father. Maybe he doesn't even know all the details, but he grew up with an incomplete story, with suspicion and accumulated hatred. Louis remained silent for a moment, absorbing everything. The missing piece had finally fallen into place. William wasn't just a racist, frustrated cop. He was the son of a man whose life had been destroyed by an accusation of treason, a stain that had never been erased and had probably marked his life forever. This wasn't just a matter of racism, it was a matter of misplaced vengeance. I need to talk to him, Louis said suddenly, standing up. I need to confront him and clear this up. We can't let the hatred and lies of the past keep defining us. Olivia looked at him, concerned. She knew Louis was right, but she also feared how William would react when faced with such a painful truth. However, she knew her husband, and she knew he wasn't one to shy away from conflict, especially when justice was at stake. Meanwhile, at the Davis home, William was sitting in his small living room, alone. Margaret had left after a heated argument that had erupted between them, and the solitude was starting to weigh on him. His thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. The arrest of Louis, the guilt he felt, and now the old memories of his father, a harsh, cold man who had spent his last years in bitterness and resentment. He had grown up hearing the same story over and over again. His father had instilled in him a distorted view of the military world, where betrayal was commonplace and mistrust of others was a virtue. But William had never known all the details, only his father's versions, filled with venom and rage. The sound of the doorbell pulled him out of his thoughts. He got up slowly, unsure of who could be visiting at this hour. When he opened the door, he found himself face to face with Louis. "We need to talk," Louis said firmly, his voice deep but without any trace of hostility. William looked at him, surprised. For a moment, he considered closing the door in his face, but something in Louis's eyes stopped him. There was a mix of determination and something else, something William hadn't expected, understanding. "All right," he finally said, opening the door for Louis to come in. Both men sat in the living room, the silence between them heavy with unresolved tensions. William felt uneasy, as if he was about to face a truth he had been avoiding all his life. "I know what your father told you about what happened on that mission," Louis began, getting straight to the point. "But there are things he didn't tell you. Things you need to know." William looked at him with distrust. "What do you know about what my father went through?" He responded, his tone defensive. "He spent his entire life being blamed for something he didn't do." "Your father was at the center of a betrayal," Louis said. "I don't know if he was guilty or not, but what I do know is that after that mission, some men died. And that left scars on all of us, not just him." William shifted uneasily in his seat. "What I'm telling you, William, is that the past isn't as clear as he made it out to be. War destroys many things, including the truth. But what we can't do is let the lies and hatred of our fathers keep defining our lives." The silence that followed was heavy. William struggled to process what Louis was telling him. Part of him wanted to cling to his father's story, to the narrative he had believed all his life. But another part, one that had been buried deep, began to wonder if, deep down, his father hadn't been as innocent as he had always portrayed him. "I can't change what happened," William said quietly, almost defeated. "But I don't know how to live with this doubt either." "You don't have to carry the weight of your father's sins," Louis responded gently. "You just have to decide who you want to be now." William looked at him, his eyes full of confusion and pain. For the first time in a long time, he felt the chains that had bound him to his past begin to loosen, even if only a little. William Davis remained seated in the living room, staring at his hands resting on his lap. Louis's words kept echoing in his mind, like an echo that wouldn't fade. "You don't have to carry the weight of your father's sins." The phrase had struck something deep inside him, a truth he had never been willing to confront. Throughout his life, William had been shaped by his father's resentment, a man who had spent his final days filled with hatred toward the army, toward the world, toward those who had branded him a traitor. And now, sitting in front of Louis, that man's son found himself face to face with a different reality. "How do you expect me to do that?" William asked, his voice barely a whisper. "My whole life has been like this. My father taught me to distrust everything, to see enemies around every corner. He taught me that the world is against us, that I was doomed to fail just like him." Louis looked at him seriously, understanding the weight William carried. He knew that, while his own past had been harsh, he had had the opportunity to redeem himself. But for William, who had grown up under the shadow of paranoia and distrust, the emotional wounds were much deeper. "It's not easy, I know," Louis replied, his voice calm. "But I'll tell you something. We're not doomed to repeat our father's mistakes. I had a complicated father too, a man who taught me the wrong lessons. But I made the decision not to be like him. It's a constant struggle, but you can change. You're not alone in this." William remained silent, absorbing Louis's words. He had never thought of his life that way. He had always believed he was destined to follow the same path as his father, that he was trapped in a narrative of hate and failure. But now, for the first time, he saw a small glimmer of hope. "And what do I do with all of this?" he finally asked, looking up at Louis. "With all the anger, with everything I was taught to hate. How am I supposed to leave it behind?" Louis leaned forward, his voice filled with sincerity. "Start by forgiving yourself. You've made mistakes, we all have. But you have the choice to learn from them, to be better. The past doesn't define you, William. Only you can decide what to do with it. But if you hold on to the anger, it will only destroy you, just like it did to your father." William felt a lump in his throat. He knew Louis was right. He had spent his entire life trying to live up to the expectations of a man who, deep down, was broken. And though he had tried to ignore it, he now understood that if he didn't change, he would follow the same self-destructive path. "I don't know if I can do it," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know if I have the strength." "It's not about strength," Louis replied. "It's about will. But I know that if you're willing, you can change. No one says it'll be easy, but it's worth it. What happened between your father and me, between your family and mine, doesn't have to be our story too." Silence filled the room again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that precedes an important decision, a life-changing moment. William looked out the window, seeing the streetlights reflecting through the glass. For the first time in a long time, he felt relieved, as if a huge weight had begun to lift from his shoulders. The next day, as the sun timidly began to peek over the horizon, William sat in his car, parked in front of his father's grave. The cemetery was deserted at that early hour, with a soft mist covering the headstones. He had been there many times before, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't looking for answers, but to close a chapter of his life. He walked slowly to the grave, feeling the dampness of the ground beneath his feet. He looked at the inscription etched into the stone, "Raymond Davis, soldier, father, hero." The words felt hollow to him now. He had clung to that image of his father for so many years, but he knew that behind that facade was a much more complicated story, a story that had marked them both forever. William knelt before the headstone, his breathing heavy, his thoughts scattered. He didn't know how to begin, but he knew he had to say something, even if it was just for himself. "Dad, I spent my whole life trying to be what you wanted me to be," he began, his voice low. "Trying to carry your fight, your hate. But I never really understood what you were fighting for. I thought I was honoring you, but all I did was carry your weight, your mistakes." He paused, feeling the emotions welling up in his chest. There was so much pent-up pain, so much resentment he had carried for years. "I don't know if you were guilty or not. I don't know if you betrayed your team or if you were a victim of circumstances. But what I do know is that I can't keep living in your shadow. I can't keep carrying this hate that's destroying me. I need to let you go, Dad." Tears began to flow from his eyes, but he made no effort to stop them. For the first time in a long time, William allowed himself to feel the pain, the anger, the regret. Everything he had buried for years came to the surface. "I forgive you, Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking. "And I forgive myself too." He stayed there in silence for what felt like hours, letting the cold morning wind surround him. It was time to leave the past behind, to let go of the anger, to start anew. And though he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, he was ready to try. Meanwhile, Louis was in his office, reviewing some documents when his phone buzzed on the desk. Picking it up, he saw a message from William. It was short, but it said everything he needed to know. "Thank you, Louis. I'm ready to change." Louis smiled, feeling a warm satisfaction inside. He knew William's journey toward redemption was just beginning, but he had taken the first step, and that was the most important part. Sometimes, the hardest battle isn't against the outside world, but against your own inner demons. And in that sense, William had started to win. As the day progressed, Louis allowed himself a moment to reflect. He knew that forgiveness and reconciliation were long and difficult paths, but he also knew they were worth it. Because, in the end, what mattered most wasn't what had happened to us in the past, but what we decided to do with our lives from that moment on. And in that moment, both he and William had decided to be better men. The sky was clear that morning, as if the universe itself was offering a truce after the emotional storms of the past few days. Louis Thompson sat in his office, watching the constant flow of people walking by the streets outside the window. There was peace within him, a serenity he hadn't felt in years. William's message had marked a turning point, not just for him, but for both of them. There was something deeply gratifying in knowing that his decision to confront and forgive William had helped change the course of another man's life. However, Louis knew that forgiveness wasn't the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new phase. William had decided to leave behind the shadow of his father, but there was more to uncover. And deep down, Louis still felt that something was unresolved, something that involved not just William, but himself. The memory of the betrayal during that mission still lingered in his mind, like a wound that had never fully healed. Suddenly, the sound of the phone pulled him out of his thoughts. It was Olivia. "Love, we need to talk." "It's important," Olivia said, her tone more serious than usual. "What's going on?" Louis asked, already used to his wife's intuition. He knew that if she said it was important, it was. "It's about Raymond Davis, William's father. I've continued investigating, and I found something I think you should know. It could completely change our understanding of what happened on that mission." Louis felt a slight twinge of unease, but also curiosity. He knew that Olivia never gave up when it came to finding the truth. It was one of the reasons he admired her so much. "I'm coming home." "We'll talk in person," Louis replied, hanging up the phone and grabbing his coat. The ride back was peaceful, but in his mind, the pieces began to shift. What had Olivia discovered? What more could be behind a betrayal that had ruined so many lives? When he got home, he found Olivia sitting at the dining table with several documents spread out in front of her. Her expression was tense, as if she wasn't sure how to break the news. "Here's what I found," Olivia began, handing Louis a file. "I was going through old military records, looking for more details about the mission. But what I found wasn't what I expected." Louis sat across from her and began to read. At first, everything seemed to be information he already knew. The mission reports, the names of the soldiers involved, the suspicion around Raymond Davis. But then, his eyes stopped on a name that left him stunned. The name of a superior officer who, according to the file, had played a crucial role in the decision to blame Raymond. "This can't be true," Louis murmured, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. The name he was reading was his father's. "Louis, your father was involved in the investigation that blamed Raymond. According to these documents, he led the commission that decided Raymond was the prime suspect, even though there was no conclusive evidence," Olivia explained, her voice calm but filled with empathy. Louis's world began to crumble at that moment. Everything he had believed about the betrayal, all the hatred he had felt toward Raymond Davis, was now tainted by the dark truth that his own father had been part of the condemnation. And the worst part was that his father, a man who had exercised cold, authoritarian control over his life, had never spoken to him about this. Why didn't he tell me? Louis asked quietly, more to himself than to Olivia. His mind searched for an explanation, a reason, anything that could justify what he was reading. But there was no easy answer. Olivia moved closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. Louis, I know this is hard. But now you understand why Raymond Davis was blamed. There was no evidence, just political and military decisions, and your father was at the center of it all. The impact of that revelation slowly settled in Louis. His father, a man who had shaped him with discipline and severity, had played a role in destroying another man's life. And now, Louis saw how that act had ruined not only Raymond, but also William, a man caught in the consequences of an injustice that should never have happened. All this time, I thought Raymond Davis was guilty, Louis said, his voice trembling slightly. And now I find out that my own father condemned him without proof. This changes everything. I know, Olivia responded. And you have every right to feel betrayed, too. But this also gives you a chance to heal. To close this chapter once and for all. Louis took a deep breath, feeling how a new layer of pain was added to the wounds he already carried. But he also knew that Olivia was right. He had spent too long blaming the wrong person. And although his relationship with William had started to improve, he knew that this truth would change everything between them. I need to talk to William, Louis said, standing up with determination. He deserves to know the truth. We can't keep living in the shadows of the past. William Davis was in his small home office, reviewing some documents when the phone rang. Seeing Louis's name on the screen, he felt a mix of apprehension and curiosity. They had talked just the day before, and though things seemed to be improving between them, much remained unresolved. Louis? William answered, hoping it wasn't a call that would reopen old wounds. William, I need to see you. It's important, Louis said, his tone serious, but with a hint of urgency. William was silent for a moment, then nodded, knowing Louis couldn't see him. All right. Tell me when and where. That afternoon, the two men met in a quiet park away from the hustle of the city. The air was cool, filled with the scent of damp earth. Louis knew that what he was about to say could undo any progress they had made, but he also knew the truth had to come out. William, what I'm about to tell you won't be easy to hear, Louis began, his tone firm. But it's something you need to know. William looked at him closely, his expression serious. I've been investigating what happened on that mission where your father was accused of treason, Louis continued. And I found out that my own father was part of the investigation that condemned him. In fact, he led the process that pointed to your father as the prime suspect, even though there wasn't enough evidence. William's face tightened, his eyes darkening as he processed the information. A heavy silence fell between them. Your father? William asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. Are you telling me that your father is responsible for what happened to mine? Louis nodded slowly. There's no excuse for what he did. I don't know why he did it or how he justified it to himself, but it's the truth. And I felt you needed to know. William clenched his fists, feeling the anger bubble inside him. All the hatred he had felt toward the world, toward the army, and toward the figure of the traitor was now redirected toward a man who wasn't even there to defend himself. But at the same time, he looked at Louis and saw the same emotional burden he had carried for years. He saw a man facing the hardest truth of all, the betrayal of his own father. I don't know what to say, William murmured, looking away. I thought I was ready to leave the past behind, but this changes everything. I know, Louis replied softly. And I don't expect you to forgive or accept it right away. I just want you to know that I'm dealing with this too, and I'm here for whatever you need. Both men fell silent, watching the leaves fall from the trees around them, carried by the gentle breeze. There was still much left to resolve, but they knew the first step had been taken. The sky was covered with dark clouds, as if the weight of the secrets that had been uncovered in the last few days also affected the weather. Louis and William walked silently through the park without any clear direction. The words that Louis had spoken still hung in the air, filled with a devastating truth that had shaken both men to their core. William felt his world collapsing again. The man he had started to see as a possible ally, even as someone who understood his pain, was now linked to the source of all his suffering. It was Louis's father, the man who had sealed Raymond Davis's fate, condemning his family to a life of anger, resentment, and bitterness. The betrayal, the real betrayal, wasn't just Raymond's. It was a system and a man who had manipulated the facts for reasons neither of them fully understood. So, all this time, everything I believed, everything I hated, William said, breaking the silence with a broken voice. It was a lie. Louis looked at him with a mixture of pain and empathy. He understood the weight of those words because he felt it too. I don't know why he did it, William, Louis replied. I've spent the last few days trying to find a reason, some clue in the files, something to tell me that maybe there was a good cause, but I didn't find one. All I know is that my father made a decision that dragged all of us into this hell. William stopped, looking off into the distance, trying to absorb everything. His breathing was heavy, and he felt the anger boiling inside him, but at the same time, something deeper flooded him. In infinite sadness, the kind of pain that comes when you realize that your whole life has been built on false foundations. How do I live with this? William asked, his voice broken. I've spent my whole life hating my father, believing he was guilty. And now I find out he was a victim. How do I stop feeling what I've felt all these years? Louis watched him, knowing there wasn't an easy answer to that question. But he knew he had to try to offer something, a small spark of hope amid so much darkness. It's not about forgetting, William. It's not about erasing the pain, because that's not possible. But it's about accepting that the past can't be changed and deciding what you'll do with the future. You don't have to follow the same path of hatred and resentment that has marked your whole life. You can do something different. William sat down on a nearby bench, covering his face with his hands. The weight of emotions overwhelmed him. His entire identity had been shaped around a narrative that was now collapsing before his eyes. He felt like he was standing on the edge of an abyss, and he didn't know if he had the strength to take the next step. Louis sat beside him in silence, giving him space. Both men shared a deep pain, one that had marked them in different ways, but that now connected them. After a few minutes, William spoke again, this time with a calmer voice, though still laden with sadness. I want to forgive, Louis. But I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can forgive your father, or even myself. I'm not asking you to forgive him, Louis said softly. I'm just asking you to give yourself the chance to forgive yourself. You've carried a weight that wasn't yours, and that's not fair. You're not defined by the mistakes of our fathers. You're more than that. William looked up at Louis, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He wasn't used to being seen with such compassion, with such clarity. Throughout his life, he had been surrounded by judgments and expectations, but never understanding. And in that moment, for the first time, he felt able to let go of some of that weight. What about us? William asked, the doubt in his voice reflecting a deep fear. After all this, how do we move forward? Louis took a deep breath, aware that his answer would define both of their futures. I don't know what comes next, William. But I think what we've started here, what we've faced together, has given us a chance. I can't change what my father did, and I can't erase the pain it caused you. But I can choose to be different. I can choose not to let the past consume both of us. A ray of sunlight broke through the clouds at that moment, as if God were giving a small sign of approval. William looked at it, and something inside him relaxed. It was as if, after years of walking in darkness, he could see a small light at the end of the path. He didn't know if he was ready to fully forgive, but he was willing to try. And that, in that moment, was enough. You're right, William finally said, with a small smile forming on his lips. We can't change the past. But we can decide what we do now. And I'm tired of living in the past. Louis smiled, nodding. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would still be dark days and moments of doubt, but both men had taken a step that would change their lives forever. The truth had come to light, and though painful, it had freed them from the invisible chains that had kept them trapped for so long. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments. What would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a show of support. This motivates us to keep uploading exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We truly appreciate having you here with us. You can click on the links appearing on your screen right now. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. Take care.